Good morning. We have a nice array of things here to look at because I have been learning about Quinacridone Violet using my favourite method of doing a mixing chart. Oftentimes you'll see a mixing chart is that like squares chart that you see a lot of people do. That is a great method, but I generally find in my practice that this method is a lot more suitable for me. And it's how I like to explore single pigments, but also it's also how I like to explore palettes as well, especially when I'm doing limited palettes. But today we're specifically looking at Quinacridone Violet PV19. And that's because, just moving these out the way, I'll go through the chart in a moment, but that is because I have nearly run out of my PV19 Rose. So you'll notice that for both of these I've said PV19. PV19 comes in a few different hues, and the most common ones you'll see in almost every brand is Rose, and it can be different names. So this is Rose Madder Lake, but it is PV19. And you'll also see Quinacridone Violet, which is also PV19. And that's the typical range you'll see, roses and violets. But you can also get other hues as well. So for example, we've got an aeroplane, I'm not sure if that's going to be in the background, but for example, Da Vinci Paint Co., if you go on their website, they have something like 7 single pigment PV19s, and one of them is alizarin crimson, and that is the usual very deep red hue that you would associate with alizarin crimson, but it is a single pigment PV19. And again, that just goes to show how one pigment can have a wide range to do with it. So today I'm going to be referring to Rose and also to Violet. Rose is what I've been using since I first started learning watercolors. So over here we have the two that I have personally used over my years of learning watercolor. I first started by using the very standard beginner's journey of the Cotman palette, but I never ended up making these swatch charts, so I don't have the original Cotman to show you because this is since been filled with professional paints. And it was many, many years ago that I used the Cotman paints. But when I first started getting into watercolors, professional watercolors, I started with the Daniel Smith Essentials set, which is the 6 colors split primary, and the cool red in that was Quinacridone Rose PV19, which is what I swatched out here. As I was learning more and starting to expand my collection over the course of years, I ended up figuring out that PV19 was something that I used a lot of, and as such it was more cost effective for me to look at brands that were cheaper in the UK and came in larger tubes. So the most cost effective method for the paints I use frequently for me as of right now and where I live is these big 21 milliliter tubes by Sennelier, and I am nearly out of this Rose Madder Lake. Now this is enough paint for me to fill a full pan or the slanted wells that I use. So I typically prefer using slanted wells. These here are also slanted wells. They're just from the Holbein palette that you can click them in and out. They're out at the moment because I've been doing a painting. This is enough for me to refill a slanted well, so it's not an immediate concern for me to go out and restock this yet. But I was recently thinking that I have been using this as my cool red since I first started, and I'm wondering recently whether my love of it comes from preference or from habit. And something that I played around with in the back of my mind is, before I restock this, learning about at least one other colour in the sort of cool red to starting to get more towards violet range. And I ended up playing with the idea of learning about Quinacridone Violet, the same pigment but a different hue, and figuring out if it would be something that I would add to my palette over Rose, or if Rose is actually my preference. It's difficult to know if something is your preference if you've not tried anything other than this. So we were at an art store recently, and a lot of the in-person art stores around me have unfortunately closed over the years. So whenever I want to explore a new pigment, I pretty much have to go online to do so. And it's usually not very cost effective to pick up one tiny tube online because of shipping costs and having to meet a shipping cart quota and things like that. So I don't often do it. I'll wait until, say, I need to restock a bunch of tubes, and then I might add one new tube in there. And we were in a physical art store because we were exploring, we were in Leeds, and there was an art store there. So I was able to go in there, and they had 5ml tubes. They had Schminke, and they also had 5ml tubes of Daniel Smith as well. And the pigeons are joining in as well. It's going to be a very background heavy video, I think. Quinacridone Violet was there, and it was a very reasonable price for the typical price range you'd expect for Schminke paints over here, and I ended up picking it up because I could just pick up the one tube. So I have been experimenting with it, and I did this chart. So typically the kinds of charts you'll see are the grids of squares. You'll see a lot of creators do them, and they are very useful, especially when you're learning about a palette. However, I find that a weakness with those grids is that you don't get to explore the full range accessible to you between two pigments. And even when I was a few years in to learning watercolors, this was the way that I ended up preferring to learn about pigments. And I ended up doing it again here. So basically the premise is that you put the basic information that you want about the paint here. So you do a gradated wash, you do the thing where you put down some water and then drop some paint in, and then that shows you how easily it flows in water. I also did a glazing here where you put down some paint, you leave it to dry, and then you glaze a layer over the top. This enables you to see how much it reactivates the paint underneath. There's nice clean lines, which shows that it is a pretty nice glazing colour. And then down here, this shows how lifting or staining a colour is by putting, again, another patch of paint down, letting it dry, and then re-wetting it and scrubbing. And I also press some paper down as well, some tissue paper down, to lift up the paint. And as you can see, it is quite staining, this paint, and that's generally the range I like to explore. By doing all of these, I also learn whether or not a paint is granulating or not as well. In this case, this is not granulating. After I've done that section, I like to explore different pigments. So for example, here we have the pigment PO62, and that is it in its purest form. And then what I do is I gradually add the paint I'm learning about, in this case the PV19 Violet, and I gradually add it, occasionally thinning it out with more water to get an idea of the range accessible to me between this pigment and this pigment. And that way I'm able to understand the paint a lot more than just the one square and then the one square thinned out that you'll typically see on the grid method. And that way I'm able to see, for example, sometimes you get really nice ranges that you might not necessarily otherwise know about. So for example, here, there's a really nice muted blue, but then I can also see all of the violets. I can also see all of the more muted teal colours over here, and I can see how the muted teal looks with the slight granulation, so I'm able to see that by doing this method. And then at the very bottom, I sometimes like to do this, where I will notice some particularly nice granulation between some colours, and I'll just explore it a little bit further down here, because it might not necessarily be as easy to see the granulation in these tiny swatches. So it's nice sometimes to do larger ones here. So the three that we have here is PG50, which is Cobalt Turquoise Light. We also have PB72, which is a type of cobalt blue. Typically when you get cobalt blue, it's usually PB28, but this is the PB72 version, and that is in its pure form here. It's a very, very heavily granulating blue, as you can see, but it ends up resulting in a very different kind of granulation from the very heavily granulating ultramarine. And then we have, like I said, the heavily granulating ultramarine. This particular one I did here, I intentionally chose the Schmincke French ultramarine because that one is the most granulating ultramarine I have out of the two that I own. And that's what I wanted to explore with this. So let's go through some of the colours. Again, we have PO62 up here, and this would be a nice range for me to start making a base for developing skin tones, and I would probably combine it with either PY129, which is azo green. So this is azo orange, this is azo green. I'd sometimes combine it with that, or maybe neutralize it down for some darker, cooler tones by adding in a blue. But this would start off some of my skin tone mixes, most likely, just going from the ranges we have in here. We also have some nice dusty roses going on with the PO62, and some much more neutralized, almost like rosy brown, dusty roses going on with the azo green. Next we have the good old PB29, which is ultramarine blue. Again, like I mentioned, this one is the French ultramarine, so it is heavily granulating. And you can see here we get some nice sort of more violet blues, so starting to get into the very, very warm blues, and gradually into blue violets, and then heading towards the violet. But it does definitely have some blue separation going on, which you can see more clearly in the patch down here. Very lovely. Next we have PB15 green shade. This is phthalo blue green shade. And again, as you would expect from, these are your typical warm blue in a split primary and a cool blue in a split primary. You're gonna get more muted purples. That's just typically how it's gonna work. You're gonna get brighter purples, and then warm, and then brighter purples, and then some more muted purples. And that is typically what you get here. I do really like this dark, moody blue that it produces by just adding a little bit. And again, this is the nice thing about gradually increasing the amount, because I get to see like, ooh, this almost looks like Prussian blue or Indenthrone. And that is what it is, washed out a little bit more with water. Then we have PG50 Turquoise Light, and again some lovely granulation, more on the muted side, even more muted than the PB15, but it doesn't quite get as dark a value as it does with the PB15. Next we have the PB72, which I mentioned is a type of cobalt blue. Again, very heavily granulating, and a little bit more on the brighter purple side, but because of that really heavy granulation, it comes across as very blue. Next we have PG7, another classic colour. This is phthalo green blue shade. It's my preferred green to have on a palette for mixing purposes, other than the Azo green, but I can that as a cool yellow, as some of you know. We don't need to get into that debate again. This produces some lovely muted colours in here that I would definitely use in my paintings. Some really greyed out purples here, but then also some gorgeous deep greens, almost blue greens going on. Love those. Next we have Phthalo Turquoise, which is this one, funnily enough. This one is the mixture version, which is PB15:3 and PG7, a mixture of phthalo blue and phthalo green, rather than the single pigment PB16 phthalo turquoise, which I do not have. Again, this produces some lovely muted tones. It mutes down the purple, but then it also produces some really interesting neutrals going on here. I would probably say that, actually up here, I was looking at these ones, that one's a different colour. So up here again, it produces some really interesting muted purples and muted blues. We may as well go on to this one. This is PG18. This is Viridian, True Viridian. True Viridian is almost exactly like PG7, but this one granulates and this one doesn't. And that's why this has a place on my palettes, because I enjoy having a granulating and a non-granulating version. This produces very similar hues as this for that reason, but again, you get, if you see in here, you get granulation. Very pretty. That also almost reminds me of Moonglow a little bit, but like a 2-pigment version. Then we have PR255. This is Pyrrole Scarlet, and this is from the remainders of my Essentials set from Daniel Smith. I have finally used up the tube, and I don't often reach for warm reds typically, so it has been lasting me years and years and years and years. This produces some really lovely muted rose colours, but nowhere near as vibrant as you would get from an actual Quinacridone Rose. Let's see, where are we at? So this is Yellow Ochre. This is PY43. This is my favourite yellow ochre at the moment, which is Daniel Smith's. And that is what it looks like in its pure form. And gradually, by adding more, you get, again, a lot of really lovely earth tones here, and then leading into dusty pinks. I would probably say that this area here is my favourite on the chart for this pigment. These, I love purples and I love muted blues and things like that, but this area is the area that really surprised me in like a lovely way. I love these tones a lot. So we also have, since I love this area, let's continue here. I also used PO48, which is Quinacridone Burnt Orange. This is unfortunately now discontinued. PO49 was discontinued, I think it was back in 2016. That was the Quinacridone Gold drama that happened in the art community. I was only just starting to learn about watercolours in more sort of like 2017 time, so I have never been able to try PO49, but PO48 has been a lovely colour for me ever since I first started using it, but it is now also discontinued, which is very sad. I still have a good amount of it in one tube. I've not like stocked up on it or anything like that. I just still have a good amount in a tube. I think I've got about half a tube left of it, but I don't know what I'm gonna do once that's discontinued. You can still buy it at the moment, but a lot of places are starting to phase it out. And then we have PBR7, this particular one here, because PBR7 has a large range to it too. This one is Burnt Umber, and it is the Da Vinci Burnt Umber. So that's what that looks like in its pure form. Again, lovely muted rosy tones and earth tones. Love them. Here we have it mixed with yellows, so the more cool side of yellows. This is PY3, this one is Hansa Yellow Light. This is the remainder of my cool yellow from the Daniel Smith selection. This isn't a colour that I use frequently at all, which is again why it has lasted me so long. But it is useful to just see, it enables me to see what this mix is like with a cool yellow and with a warm red, even though these aren't colours I typically pick up often. Then we have PY150. This is my preferred yellow, is PY150. That's what it looks like in mass tone, but watered down, that ends up becoming a more yellow tone. It looks a lot more earthy in mass tone, and then it becomes a lot more of a bright yellow. These both produce some, I would argue, muddy colours. Interesting, but muddy yellows. And then it starts getting into some, again, more muted rosy tones. So I'm not sure if I'd reach for those that much in comparison to other tones on here. But interesting to know, now I know. And that is one good thing about doing this method, is I can see like, I probably wouldn't reach for that range frequently. It might have its place for one particular piece, but there's other mixes that I would prefer than these. This is just a green that I mixed. I honestly can't remember which paints. I think I used PG7 and maybe PO48. No, it would have been PG7, PY150, and then probably the Quin Rose was probably what produced that. And then we went over those. So that was a very long ramble, but I hope that it was interesting to see how I like to learn about pigments. To start off with, this isn't all I'll do. This is how I like to lay the groundwork for learning about a pigment. And then from here, what I do is actually start using it on paintings and start to explore it in limited palettes. So I've shown this in a previous video, but I like to explore trios quite frequently to do full illustrations, and that enables me to really, really learn about not just combining colour mixing, but also it helps me to learn about each of the three pigments involved, because you get a nice range of colours when you have three, but it's, I knocked you there, I'm sorry, but it is enough of a range that you can get a lot of colours out of it. That is why those paints are on this palette, by the way, is because I've been doing an illustration at the moment, which is a trio of this colour. So this is my main palette, and then I took these off my expansion palette, and this is the trio I've been using, is those two and the Azo Green. And that's generally how I like to learn about pigments, is to do, if I really want to learn colour mixing, then I'll do a sheet like this, and then I get into practicing with paintings and limited palettes and actual practice, because even with this, any chart, any swatching is only going to teach you so much. The vast majority of your learning experience, at least in how I've noticed learning, a lot of the learning comes from actually doing the paintings and learning from them. And this helps a lot, but it's not going to be a replacement for actually using this in illustrations. So I'm excited to see what I end up thinking of this in practice. At the moment, I would probably say that it is not making me feel like, yes, this will replace PV19 Rose. It's definitely not making me think of that. I can see its uses for sure. But again, I'll only really be able to form a strong opinion on it by doing actual paintings. So it's going to be very interesting going forward and learning about Quinacridone Violet. And hopefully I can form a full opinion by the time I do actually need to restock. But for now, I'm just having fun experimenting. So I hope this was interesting and a little insight into another way of learning about colour mixing and about colours and things. If you have any questions about the paint, about this process or anything, leave them down in the comments. But other than that, I will see you next time. Bye!